بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we're continuing in our lessons on Islamic theology, or what we had called Doctrine in Islam, the Doctrine of Islam, and we are at the second lecture. So the outline for today's lesson, inshallah, is going to revolve around the notion of religion. And as we will see, the author of the book is going to say that religion is basically constituted of two main parts. One part that is beliefs and one part that is actions. And this is nothing controversial or new. This is what we call usul al-din and furu' al-din. So we'll get into a little bit more detail about that. But generally speaking, he's going to present this basically split between beliefs and action. And he's going to equate the notions of usul al-din with worldview, and we'll talk about that. And he's going to equate the notion of furu' al-din or action with ideology. And we'll talk about that too. And then he'll talk about, without any discussion and without going into any details, he'll talk about the beginning, or what we can call the origin of religion. And he will just present very quickly a proof that is the actual correct proof, the best proof that we have as Muslims, which is al-fitra, which is the raw, unaltered human nature. So he'll briefly touch on that. And after that, he'll talk about things that are considered common to worldviews of the monotheistic religions. He'll make a difference or distinction between what he calls true religions and false religions. So generally speaking, that's kind of the outline of the first lesson. So we'll kind of go through the same logic, but I think the crowd, the audience that we have, a lot of you are very familiar with a lot of these notions. So I think we can push a little bit on a lot of them, just a little bit more detail, and talk about the structure and the arguments and the terminology that he's using. I think it would be beneficial to all of us, inshallah. So before actually going into the topic, before going into the beginning of his book, the first lesson, there's a topic, and I decided to use the exact terminology that we find in Arabic words, which is sharaf al-din, or sharaf al-aqa'id, or sharaf al-kalam, with sharaf al-ilm. Okay, so I'm translating it literally because I want to make a point, which is the honor of a discipline, and in this case the honor of theology or the honor of beliefs. So this is not addressed in the book, but every theology book, every classic textbook in theology has this as an introduction before we get into the topic. So I decided that we would have it here. As I said, I'll try to make it as complementary, not only of that book, but all the major works too. So this is very quickly, and I think it'll be beneficial for us, for any discipline, and then for us to understand how theology fits into the rest of the network or the hierarchy of disciplines that we have. So and I'm going to try to always never get to anything from my own pocket, so I'll always refer to other works. So for this specific one, I'm taking it, this presentation, I'm taking it from a work called Muqaddimah fi Usul al-Din, or an introduction to Usul al-Din, or to the beliefs of Islam, from Sheikh Wahid al-Khurasani. So as a side note, I think it's worth mentioning that most of our scholars who have written Risala Amaliyya, so this is the practical law of Islam, their verdicts from beginning to end about all the chapters of practical law of Islam, most of them, I'm not going to say all of them, but most of them, before starting with the law part, with the fiqh part, they start with a theological introduction. And with time, they often take that work, which is usually 50, 70 pages at the beginning, that summarizes all of beliefs in one place. They take that a few years later and they publish it as a standalone work. So most of our scholars have done that. So if you go to the original version of the Risala Amaliyya, the beginning of it, the beginning chapter, before they go into At-Taqleed and Al-Tahara and Al-Salah, they have a chapter about a summary of an introductory summary to beliefs. So this is the case for Shaykh Al-Wahid Al-Khurasani, where he has a Muqaddimah fi Usul al-Din, both as in his Minhaj al-Salihin as well as a standalone work. And in there he talks a little bit about Sharaf al-Aqa'id or Aqidah. And he says that, and I'm using him because it's a very simplified version. There's a much more complex version, but this is a good one for our purposes. He says that the way we can determine, or the way we assess what we can call the honor of a discipline, of an Islamic discipline, or what really is the importance of it in terms of the hierarchy of all the disciplines, is by looking at three specific criteria. So the first one is the object of study of that discipline. The second criteria is the purpose that we're trying to gain out of that study. And the third one is the type or the strength of proofs or evidence that we use in that discipline. So this can apply to anything. So let's say when you look at the object, for instance, if someone tells you, and of course some of it, I'm presenting it in the classic version, okay? I'm not going into the debate of this. But if someone says, for instance, that I want to study mineralogy, I want to study minerals. And someone else says that I want to study animals or human beings. The object of study in one case is considered more important and therefore more honorable than another. And so we establish, that's the first criteria. The object of study, what are you studying? The second criteria is the purpose. So what are you trying to gain out of this study? What's the outcome? In the best case scenario, what can you do that you couldn't do before? What will you know that you didn't know before? And so again, let's say the purpose in one case is, I don't know, in one discipline will allow you to better manage your money, and another discipline will allow you to heal your body. So you can see that you can actually have a hierarchy between them. And finally, the strength of evidence. So we have many sciences, or many disciplines, let's call them, where the type of the evidence provided is considered conjectural. It's not 100% certain. Whereas in others, we need 100% certainty. So that's a very big topic that I'm not going to touch on. To what extent is it possible to reach 100% certainty on anything? But let's use the simplistic version of it for now and say, generally speaking, in aqa'id, everybody agrees that our religion does not accept al-dhann, does not accept conjecture, does not accept probability in aqa'id, in beliefs. You have to know black and white. You may have to change your belief later, but at this time, for everything that you have doubt, you have to go look and find an answer to it. Especially for the fundamental beliefs. There are things that are considered more detailed and secondary. You can get to them later or follow someone else and so on and so forth. So if we look at theology or beliefs by looking at these. So first of all, the object of study. What's the object of study of beliefs? And I talk a little bit about it in the next one, I'll get back to it, which is how do we define aqa'id? The classic definition that was used is a little bit different than what we use today, and this is why we said at the beginning, this book is more modern. The classic version of kalam or aqa'id, they say that the object of study and the purpose of study as well is to study God, which means you study His existence, His attributes, and His actions. That's theology. That's aqa'id and that's ilm al-kalam. So if we start with that, the first criteria, the object of study of theology, God. Obviously, as believers, we do not think that there is anything more important, higher on the hierarchy, more honorable as an object of study than God. So as for the first criteria already, we can see that theology is ahead of pretty much any other discipline. The purpose, and we can talk a lot about this. If we look specifically at ilm al-kalam, the classic definition that has been given for ilm al-kalam is that it is intended to study and analyze, to understand the beliefs and to be able to argue them and to be able to refute false beliefs or refutations. So there's a polemical dimension, and there's also a dimension where it is for myself. I want to better understand the tenets of belief of my own religion. So it starts with that, but then depending on if you want to become a scholar or is it for your own purposes. So the classic definition adds the polemical dimension and says, and therefore you must also be able to defend your beliefs and to refute false claims. This is one version. This is very academic, functional, and I'll talk about it in the next slide, functional definition of ilm. Beyond that, however, I think we have to look at the purpose from a different angle. Everything that we study, we have to ask ourselves, is it worth our time and our investment and our effort or not? What does it give us? It has to give us some benefit, either in this life or the next. There are types of knowledge that are called instrumental, just to go directly to the topic. So if anyone wants to properly study religious sciences, they may actually spend a few years at the beginning studying topics like 3, 4, 5 sub-disciplines in Arabic. So you'll study syntax and sarf and other balagha and eloquence and so on and so forth. You'll spend a few years studying that. And you'll also spend a little bit of time studying logic and a few other, let's call them instrumental or supporting sciences. Do we need them? Absolutely. If you don't have them, you won't be able to get into the other disciplines. But then when you compare the object, the purpose, of the strength of evidence of those disciplines with a discipline like, for instance, ilm al-hadith, where you study the narrations, or tafsir al-Quran, where you study the commentaries on the interpretation of the verses of the Quran, or kalam, or law, practical law in Islam, then you see that there is definitely a difference between instrumental sciences and those other sciences. The point of all of this, however, is what? Is it just to accumulate knowledge? No. And if it's just accumulation of knowledge, I think we're headed in a world where I think the technology has far surpassed us, and who knows what will happen next. And you can probably condense 1,000 encyclopedias in someone's brain in a second, and you can download everything directly from the internet into your brain, perhaps in a few years. It's not about the accumulation of knowledge, although that is very important. And that becomes the premise and a condition for something else. But that something else requires a change of attitude. The point in studying all of the disciplines is that we get to a transformational type of knowledge. It has to transform the spirit. If it doesn't transform the spirit, we have a problem. Basically, you're accumulating information. You're no different than a storage disk where information is accumulating, but it doesn't transform. It doesn't change your spirit, your soul into anything better. And the whole point of this, and if you go into the Quranic verses and the narrations, the whole point of knowledge is so that you continuously improve spiritually. So although we're going to be giving a lot of information and analyzing a lot of information because we're trying to go fast, keep in mind the general attitude we're supposed to adopt in all of this is that this is so that we are better people. At the end, this is what it's supposed to do. And we all know the narration from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, where he says, ilm is not the accumulation of knowledge or information. ليس بالتعلم ليس بكثرة التعلم ولكن نور يقذفه الله في قلب من يشاء ويهديه. It is a light that God throws or places into the heart of whomever He wishes to guide. So keeping that in mind, and I won't go into more detail than that, that should be a separate series of lectures. This is the ultimate purpose that we're trying to get from aqa'id. Specifically aqa'id, especially when we're saying that the object of study is God. The point of this is to get closer to God, to better understand Him. Think of it in a different context. If there's someone that you really admire and that you really like, you want to get to know everything about them. And the more you know, the more you love, and the more you love, the more you want to know. And there's a cycle there. That's what we're hoping to get with all of this. The strength of evidence, as we said, I don't think I need to explain it more. In aqa'id, What is expected is that you have very clear, certain proofs, evidence, arguments for every aspect of your belief that you have. And so this course is supposed to at least provide you with the one version and one layer of arguments for all the major tenets of your belief. So the notion of deen. And now we get into the actual lesson in the book. Deen, as we know, is usually translated as religion. So this lesson is supposed to be an introduction to the notion of deen or religion. The reason why we're trying to define first is that we're trying to distinguish between this field and other fields. So this object of study and other objects. This attitude, this approach, this methodology, these tools, and other ones. So religion can be studied from various angles, through various disciplines. This is one of them that studies religion. We can study it from a historical perspective. We can study it from an economic or socio-political perspective. We're studying it from a kalam perspective, and this is the point of this whole course. Linguistically, obviously the word deen is Arabic, and it has many, many meanings. There are two meanings that stand out, and those are the two that are mentioned in the book. The first one is obedience. And the second one is, and I use both here, reward or outcome. So this is the linguistic meaning of the word deen in Arabic. So when you say Maliki Yawmiddin in Surah Al-Fatiha, Maliki Yawmiddin, most likely, most interpreters, they say it's Yawm al-Jaza, Yawm al-Hisab, which is the day of the outcome, the result, the reward, and so on and so forth, in that sense. And deen can also be obedience, and the Quran uses that terminology and that definition as well. What concerns us for this course, however, is not the linguistic definition of deen. It's the technical or terminological definition of deen. So how is it used in a specific sense, not what language says it means. And so there's two ways to define it, and we talked a little bit about both in the previous slide. One way to define, and so this is not religion, it's anything. You can define it with what they call an essentialist point of view. So you look at the essence, the thing in itself. So the thing in itself, what is it meant to do? What is it? And then you look at the function. What function does it perform? So if you study, for instance, Nahu or the grammar in Arabic, the function is that it allows you to speak in a manner that is error-free, let's say, or to build sentences in an error-free manner. That's a functional definition. Or you understand how the grammar is actually built, the syntax in Arabic is actually built. That's an essentialist definition. You're looking at a thing in itself. And we talked a little bit about both, so I'm not going to spend more time. The essentialist definition for beliefs or kalam is God, and if we want to go into a little bit more detail, the existence of God, the attributes of God, the actions of God. And everything that we have in our belief system stems from those. So when we talk about Adl al-Ilahi, and we'll talk about it in a second, or al-Nubuwah, which is prophethood, or al-Ma'ad, they are all functions and derivatives of this notion of God, His existence, His attributes, His actions. And if we look at the functional, we already said, it's to establish the validity of the arguments that we use for our belief system. So the author says that religion is basically comprised of two elements: faith, or aqa'id, which are referred to as usul al-din, and furu' al-din, which are the practical teachings of Islam. The problem that we may encounter with this sort of definition, however, is that as a Muslim it works. But if you are non-Muslim and you look at this, you start having problems. If you follow a religion of the New Age movements, you may have a problem with this. You can have different things that will fall under this definition and different things that will fall out, and it becomes kind of loose and not so accurate. So one of the ways some of the commentators have proposed is that we simply say that a religion is a set of coherent beliefs from which are derived a set of coherent practical teachings. And he will actually say that, but he doesn't say that at this level. When he introduces it, he simply says religion is made up of usul al-din and furu' al-din. Usul al-din are your set of beliefs in God and everything that derives from them. And your furu' al-din are the ones that we know, the 10 that we know, starting from Salah, Sawm, Hajj, Jihad, Zakah, Khums, Amr al-Ma'ruf, Nahi anil. So prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, Zakah, Khums, and then the 4 which are problematic because they may or may not fall under the practical aspect of religion or the belief aspect of religion, which is, for instance, tawalli and tabarri, or enjoining good and forbidding evil, for instance. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when he equates all of this, and I'm going very quickly over all of this because I know you guys know all of this part. But very quickly, just to make sure that this notion is understood. So he goes back in time and he says when people used to refer to a non-religious person, what did they mean? And he gives examples of the terminology that was used. For instance, they say a zindiq or a dahri or, and we have the same terminology today. So someone who's heretic or an atheist, or he says all of that can be summarized under one term, which is non-religious. So what is a non-religious person? A non-religious is one person, a person who does not respect one or the other of both sides of religion. So you may have the belief system, but you do nothing about it in practice. You can be called non-religious. Or you do some things, but you have no belief system. You give charity, but you don't believe in anything. You are considered non-religious. So you need both items together, both halves, basically, belief and action, to have religion and to be called religious. So these are quick notions and points that he mentions that I'm mentioning as well, so that when you read the text, it's very clear to you if you do decide to read the text. So the image is very clear in Arabic, and people who have studied a little bit of introductory works to Islam, the idea of usul al-din and furu' al-din. And you have the image of a tree, where the asl is either the roots or the trunk, and furu' al-din are the branches of that tree. So of course, as important as the branches are and the fruits on the branches are, really you cannot have any branches if you don't have a trunk and you don't have roots. And this is supposed to give you an idea of the relationship between actions, which are the branches, and your belief system, which is the foundation and the infrastructure that you need to build all your actions. So that's the first thing. Secondly, this is where the author switches and equates these very classic notions that we all know of usul al-din and furu' al-din to much more modern notions. And these notions are worldview and ideology. So we have to take a little bit of time to understand both notions. He says that a worldview is the universal and coherent set of beliefs. This is summarizing his entire part on worldview. So we can spend a little time about each one of these three aspects of a worldview, which basically is universal, coherent, and beliefs. Universal as opposed to particular. So anyone who has studied logic or philosophy knows that there's a distinction made between universals and particulars. Everything we encounter in our daily lives is a particular. We see instances and individuals and things that are unique in themselves. What our mind can do is look at 2 or 3 or 10 or a million things and abstract or extract common characteristics, properties, relationships that we find in the individuals and the instances and create universals with them. So a universal is never encountered in real life. And this has generated gigantic discussions in philosophy about universals and nominalism, and different philosophers have addressed this differently. Plato says universals actually exist in the world of universals, which he calls ideals, or it's usually translated as ideals. And some of our scholars have said that there is a world that's called ideals. So anything that you see in our world, let's say ilm, knowledge, actually has an ideal and it exists somewhere, and they use Quranic verses to prove that it does, in an absolute, perfect, infinite form in there. And they associate that with al-khaza'in. When the Quran says, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا عِندَنَا خَزَائِنُهُ. There is no thing except that we have its treasuries, and we only descend it to you in a very calculated manner, right? So there are verses that talk about this if you want to interpret it in that way. Anyways, so when you say universal, you're talking about a higher level of abstraction. You're talking about very generic principles that you apply to specific things. So the details of beliefs are not addressed in this field. That's one. So when you say worldview, worldview doesn't concern the details and the particulars and the specifics and things that are contextual, in context, which is depending on time and where you are and who you are. If you get into that, if you need that aspect in an argument, you're not in the worldview. It has to be coherent. If the beliefs are contradictory, then you cannot really talk about a worldview. Let's keep it at that level. And finally, a worldview has to do with beliefs, so not actions. And then he repeats a similar explanation for the notion of ideology. So I'm not going to repeat that what a universal is and that it is coherent, but ideology is the same explanation, but it has to do with the set of practical teachings. Okay, so I won't go into more than that. What's the relationship between usul al-din and furu' al-din, or worldview and ideology? The first, and this is a very important notion, point that we have to make is that all actions, all human actions, derive from beliefs. And I think a lot of people think that that is the case, and we live our lives that way, but in reality we don't really fully appreciate what that means. If we look at an individual, or we look at a society, or we look at a group, and we can apply that to ourselves as well, what we usually try to do when we want to change someone's behavior is we adopt, most likely, a behaviorist approach. So we do things that directly have to do with their behavior. We want to train them in a behavioral way. And that works. There's a whole psychological school called the behavioralist school that tries to do that, and it's entirely based on that. If we accept the premises that we're saying here, we're basically saying, if we want to change someone's behavior at the core, you have to change their belief system. If I want to stop smoking, you have to change my belief system in smoking. If you want to change someone's behavior, changing the context maybe is not enough to change their belief system. If I just simply remove you and put you in timeout, or take you out and put you in a prison cell, I'm not sure I'm changing your belief system. The reason why you committed the action you committed, performed the action you performed, is because of your belief system. And unless that belief system is changed with whatever means, then that action will most likely re-emerge. So this is good for us too. If you want to stop doing something, you want to start doing something, and you see that you're lacking the motivation to do it, you can't have the discipline to do it, the problem is in your belief system. And there's a big discussion here at this point that I'm just gonna mention quickly and move on to the rest of the lesson. But then there's a whole question of, sometimes we know that something is wrong and we do it. Or we know that something is right and we don't do it. So how do we explain that? And the scholars of akhlaq and ethics have answered that question. And they've said it's because you don't believe. You have a theoretical understanding. You logically accept their argument, but you have no belief. Belief only comes when you feel it. And this is the difference between belief in philosophy, they say, and in Islamic philosophy especially, they say is automatic. You cannot have the choice of understanding or not. Knowledge is automatic. If the arguments are accepted by your brain, by your mind, by your intellect, then the result of those arguments is automatic. Belief is not like that. You have to make a jump from there to say, and this is actually true for me. And this is why, for some of our scholars have said, we all know that a dead body will not do anything, but most of us will not be able to spend the night beside a corpse. Why? This is the difference between knowledge and belief. Your belief system is not there. Your belief system is still giving you doubts and creating things in your mind that your reason is saying, oh, this is nothing, it's nonsense. Yeah, but I'm still afraid and I can't do it. So this is where you have to make, this is where you see the clear distinction between knowledge and belief. And this is addressed in ilm al-akhlaq and in moral philosophy and ethics, where they spend a lot of time on these notions. Anyway, so this is the first point. And this is also important for us. If someone says, in my belief system, you see one person when they perform their prayer, the most important thing for them is the actions of the prayer and how they're performed, and the actions of the wudu, or the actions of pilgrimage. That you want to do it in the most technically accurate manner. And another person, when they're performing their wudu or they're performing their prayer, the most important thing for them is that they have a spiritual connection with the symbol and with what's behind that action, with what it's supposed to represent, a connection with God, for instance. This is stemming from their belief system. You want to change that, you have to change your belief system. And to change your belief system, you have to change your knowledge, oftentimes. Anyways. And this is also good for us when someone comes and says, why do you pray? Why do you fast? Why do you do? Okay, you're asking me about an action. You have to ask me about my belief system, and then the action simply derives from that. And we can talk about that action too. But let's start with the belief system, and then this just comes out of it automatically. That's one. The second point is the logical relationship between worldview and ideology. So I wrote it in a very succinct manner here, which is basically, it's a relationship of necessity, but not sufficiency. In other words, ideology requires, by necessity, a worldview. In order to do, you must have belief. And we're talking about voluntary actions. In order to do, you must have a belief. But if you have a system of belief, if you have a full understanding of your system of belief, does it automatically mean that you know exactly what to do and how to do it? No. So it is necessary for it to exist, for it to happen, but it's not sufficient. You need more. And this is why, for instance, my system of belief, let's say, I believe that there is a God, and I believe that there is a religion, and I believe that it was communicated to me. Does that necessarily mean that I have to pray a prayer in the morning before the sun rises that is comprised of 2 rak'at? No. Right? So this is where we see that there is a necessary link between ideology and worldview. I would never perform that prayer if I didn't have the belief system. It is necessary for it, but it's not sufficient. The belief system itself will stop at a certain point, and then I really have to get into the details of the practical system, which is a system of law. And this cannot be made up. It has to come based on the premises that I established in my system of beliefs. And that's why we say that it is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need more. Last point. The author talks about ideology in two senses. One of them being the restricted sense, and the other being in a larger sense. The restricted sense is the way he has so far identified ideology, which is as we said, a universal, coherent set or system of practical teachings or rules. This is his definition, and I'll come back to that in the next slide. This is a restricted definition of ideology. In what sense is it restricted? He says ideology has actually, as a term, been used in a much larger sense. It is used for this, he claims, and it is used in a much larger sense. In the larger sense that he talks about, he says ideology is not only as wide as a worldview, it's actually wider. So in that sense, an ideology comprises your entire set of practical teachings, in addition to your entire worldview. So he's basically making a terminology or a technical distinction. He's saying if you read books and you hear lectures and you go into philosophy and other fields, you'll see different uses for the term ideology. One of them is very restrictive. And this is the term that he has chosen to use in this book, which is the set of practical rules. So your actions, your system of actions in Islam, furu' ad-din. But we will also encounter in other works a use of ideology, which means not only your entire system of actions, but your entire system of beliefs as well. So he's saying that exists, but I will not be using it in that manner. So this is just a terminological distinction that he makes, so I'm only explaining it.
but I have to talk about it a lot more than this. So this is the next slide. So here are a few remarks about all of this. The first one is very generic, and I think this is something that we all have to keep in mind, especially as most of us very educated people living in the West. Most of our religious background is going to come from works and teachings and sermons and lectures and things that we hear from scholars not living in our societies in the West. They are living in another world, with another background, with another terminology and another culture, and so on and so forth. Where's the issue with that? The issue is that while they are addressing the issues that they encounter in their world, they're also trying to address other issues. Either because those issues are starting to infiltrate the world they know, or because they hear about issues that others are encountering, like us living outside, and they need help for it. And so they need answers, and they need arguments, and they need teachings. So, what do? They get to work, they study these issues as best they can, and they give us those teachings. The issue that we have is that those scholars, because they have not directly interacted with intellectuals in the West, they have not lived on academic campuses, they have not spent time in these societies, most of the information they get concerning specifically these issues is secondhand. They have to rely, they are only as good as the people around them and the works they have access to when addressing some of these issues. So this is a general remark, and this is not to take away from the amazing, incredible efforts that they put into explaining all of these issues and providing answers and solutions to many of the problems everybody faces. But from a very accurate, precise manner, this is where we have to see people with expertise step up. And if you want to do anything, is you respect the expertise of your scholar, but you also give him the tools so that he can actually do this part of his job. He can apply his tremendous expertise in religion, he can apply it to these other non-religious notions and fields and give you a religious answer. Like, let's say we take, for instance, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about that in future lectures in one of the next slides. At some point, there was a tremendous influence taking place in the Middle East with everything having to do with communism, socialism, Marxism, and so on and so forth. And so the top thinkers of the time are not going to limit themselves to the issues happening in their world. They're noticing that there's something happening and they need to react to it. So what do? They start studying it. And that's when you see suddenly, out of the blue, like works, for instance, like Our Economy or Our Philosophy come out of the blue. Or some of the works of Sayid Jafar, or some of the works like the works of Sheikh Misbah and others. So what are they doing? They're noticing that there is a weakness in the current system that we have. People need more. People in universities, people who read, people who are exposed need more than what we have. And so they start creating an entire infrastructure. Years later, when people finally start understanding what was in that work and the work circulates, you will have someone maybe who will come and say, did Shahid al-Sadr actually properly and accurately understand the theory of John Locke in economics and Our Economy or not? Was this a completely accurate, if you take a professor of economics in the West who reads this passage, will they be in agreement in how Shahid al-Sadr interpreted John Locke's theory before he refuted it or took the good and left the bad? This is where we start seeing the expertise come in. And this, unfortunately, is not taking place early enough in a lot of the works. If the scholars were using the right books, and they had the right experts around them telling them, this is the work, and from these 37 works, we have 4 that have been translated, and from these 4 that have been translated, this one is the one you should read. If no one is doing that to the scholar, it's going to be hit and miss. And this happens often. Now, I'm not saying this is what happened with Shaykh al-Sadr. I'm giving an example of what could happen. So if we go to the topic at hand, we're talking about worldview and ideology. Do the notions, the concepts of usul al-din and worldview overlap 100%? So we have to spend time understanding what a worldview is. And then we'll compare that notion with the notion of usul al-din to see if we can say usul al-din equals worldview. And then we will do the same thing with furu' al-din. We have to study the notion of ideology as it is understood in the West, as it is understood by those who put it in place. And then we can say, can we actually put an equal sign between ideology and furu' al-din or not, as the author has done. So very quickly, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time to create that nuance. This is something that we'll keep in mind in general, not only for this work, not only for this course, keep it in mind for anything and everything that you hear. If it's a non-Islamic, non-religious technical term that is being used and introduced, I'm not saying your guards should go up, but add a layer of scrutiny to what you're hearing and analysis and making sure that the terms are properly understood before you yourself go and deliver a lecture on worldviews and ideologies and someone tells you you don't know how to use those terms properly. So I'm talking about two things. First of all, tradition. Any notions, I'm talking about deep notions, therefore philosophical. Any notion, no notion exists in a vacuum. They all exist in a tradition. You cannot take a notion and look at what the language says it means and say, therefore, that's what it means if you're talking in a field. You have to look at what that field says about that notion. And the other aspect is connotation, and I'll talk about that too. There's a history. There's an evolution to that notion. So it's therefore loaded. When you use a term and the expert hears the term, he's thinking about that entire history and that entire development. Where did it start? What developments happened? And how is it used today? So if we take the notion of worldview, what is a worldview? The general idea, today there's a mix between two things, because there's a German version of the word Weltanschauung, which is basically view of the world, which is often associated with worldview, although there's a discrepancy in philosophy. And then there is the rest of the world and how they use it. The majority of the use of the word today is, yes, it has a practical aspect, but in reality it is a set of belief with a practical aspect in politics, in sociology, and sometimes in economic dimensions. So if you say, for instance, a green movement, an ecology, yes, that's a worldview. You're looking at the whole world with the drive to do something about it. So these are worldviews. I'm going to go back a little bit. I don't want to mix it too much with ideology, because ideology and worldview overlap. And I want to keep them distinct. What happened at the end and after the scientific age started? Let's keep it short. After the scientific age started, there was a movement by a number of thinkers and scientists to start refuting religion. So they started using the term worldview to provide an alternative to the religious worldview, which now was a scientific worldview. This is about 200 years ago. Around the 1900s, a number of Christian thinkers started to move against that. And they started saying, just like they're fighting us at the level of worldview, we're going to fight them at the level of worldview. And this is mostly in the US, this was not in Europe. What happened is that they said, for instance, someone who reads the Bible from beginning to end as a believer is not going to read it in the same way as a non-believer would read it. And there is nothing you can do to the non-believer to make him or her read it as a believer would. And there is nothing you can do to the believer to make them read it like a non-believer would. And this is what a worldview means. And so you Christians, this is a preacher of those works, the preaching works, you Christians must defend your worldview. These are worldviews, these are paradigms, these are lenses through which you see the reality of the world that cannot speak with each other. They're fundamentally different. In the philosophy of science, they say they're incommensurate. You can't translate one into the other. Therefore, don't even try. Work on your own belief. They can do whatever they want. but they'll never believe what you believe because their starting points are different. This is where you get into what they call axioms, or the starting point that is non-negotiable and you can't argue it. What are your starting points that you can't argue? So this is the idea of a worldview. So if I want to use the idea of a worldview, I should probably decide, can worldviews talk to each other, or are they completely separate, for instance? And am I keeping all of that in mind when I say worldview equals usul al-din? This is how the rest of the world understands this notion. This is the evolution of it, in their culture, in their philosophy, in their history. That's one. Let's take the notion of connotation. A connotation is basically the part that goes unsaid in a word. When you hear it, you feel something, but it's not part of the linguistic definition. I don't know, if I said the word, let's say implicated. Do you use the word implicated for something positive or always in something negative? Was someone implicated in a win? If they participated in a win, were they implicated in it? Or are you implicated in more like an offense or a crime? This is a connotation. It's not the definition of the word, it's a connotation. The word is loaded with something more than the language. So if we look at the word ideology, does the word ideology have a connotation? It does have a connotation. And anyone who is strong enough, their language, the mother tongue is English, or they know enough English or French or many other languages that have borrowed the term in whole or in part, you know that there's a connotation. They say that ideology started by a scholar who was trying to replace the whole system of psychology with something more scientific. And then when it reached Napoleon, he used the term in a very, very negative manner. And later, when Marx wrote his works, he used ideology in that same very negative manner. He's referring to dogma. He's referring to propaganda. And then afterwards, socialist, Marxist, communist thinkers, Louis Althusser, I don't know if you guys know the whole literature of communism, he's one of their giant thinkers. He has an essay actually called Ideology and Ideological State Apparatus, or Apparatus, where he explains how the church, financial institutions, social institutions, school, and so on and so forth are all ideological apparatuses that are used to indoctrinate people to produce in the way that the bourgeois or the elite class needs, so that the proletariat keeps the system going for them. The working class stays and keeps, which is the entire basis of their philosophy. But this is the connotation that people understand when they hear the word ideology. So for me to now take it and say, and therefore ideology equals furu' ad-din. This is what we've done. And so if I go to them and I engage in a discussion, or write an essay, or I write a book, or I give a speech, and I want to use the word ideology because I think this is the terminology that they use, I think I'm going to have a problem. And so I just wanted to add that the notion, the explanation that he gave, there's absolutely nothing wrong. And in fact, if you follow what a dictionary may say, it may still be good. But then you need that additional layer, the contextual layer, that I don't know if he has it or not, but it becomes problematic for someone like us trying to use this terminology. It becomes problematic. Worldview is a lot better, and then we have to use it in the way he defined it. So he said a worldview is God, the universe, and the human. So if we use it in that sense, we're good, but that's what he's introduced. That's why at the end I'm saying maybe it would have been better to use maybe two terms like a metaphysical position, that would be the accurate way. What is your metaphysical position, which includes your entire theory of knowledge and your theory about existence. And that includes God, the universe, and yourself. And that will be your entire system of beliefs. And then praxis, which is the term that is usually used in philosophy to talk about anything and everything practical. And it solves another problem, which I didn't really want to talk about, which is our religion only usul al-din and furu' ad-din, and belief and practical law? Or do we actually have a third dimension that is not included in there, that is ethics? And so where is it in furu' ad-din and usul ad-din? And in praxis, it is included. Everybody who hears praxis knows that it can have the obligatory actions, and it can also have anything that falls under values, and ethics, and moral systems. Anyway, so that was a bit of a critique. two brackets and we come back. Theistic and materialistic worldviews. And we'll go a little bit faster so that we finish. Are worldviews limited to religions? No. Worldviews, as we said, any system of coherent beliefs is called a worldview. They apply to religions. Are they limited to good religions and true religions? No, they can be in any religion. Same thing with ideology. Dialectical materialism. He says that today in the world there are two major worldviews. There is the theistic, the worldviews that have God at the center, and the materialistic worldviews. And he says the biggest representative of the materialistic worldview is dialectical materialism. I'm going to let that go with the condition for us here that do not forget that he was writing this in the 70s. And today in 2018, I'm not sure how many of us would agree that dialectical materialism is the biggest representative of materialism or materialist worldview. Perhaps scientism, or the view that science itself is a worldview, and that requires many lectures on its own, is perhaps the strongest proponent of a materialistic worldview, but there are others.
It's almost like a Marxist reading of
Exactly.
society. That.
And it's fine for the context they were in because
Yes.
that's what they were confronted with.
Mm.
But that's where we have to see, okay, take the good and leave the rest because our context is different. And he will have specific lessons about that, and we'll see how do we use that for our benefit today when it's not necessarily about that. It's not necessarily about Marxist, communist, socialist philosophies. What do we do with that? Is it still useful to study this or not? So this will be subsequent lessons. Origins of religion. He jumps directly into the argument saying that the origin of religion is the unaltered, perfect human nature, which is al-fatra. In itself, absolutely nothing wrong with that. We all believe that. That's what the Quran says. The origin of religion, religious thought, monotheism, belief in God, and everything that comes out of it comes from al-fatra. Are there other origins of religion or not? We will discuss that in lessons 2 and 3. There will be much more discussion about that, and he will get into some of that, but we'll need to complement it with a lot more. He says that there are true religions that have God and a proper, coherent system of belief around them, and there are false religions. And false religions stem from two major reasons, from two major factors: misconceptions and mistakes, and intentional distortions. And here we go into a very big topic that we won't have time to discuss today. In anthropology and in religious studies and in religious and philosophy of religion, they say that the initial primitive ancient societies were all polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods. And that thought evolved as those societies matured and evolved and developed, all the way to monotheism. That's a general classic argument. Recently, however, there have been some anthropologists who have questioned this. And they say when we go back and we study the societies and the communities of the hunter-gatherers, we can see that a lot of them were actually monotheistic. And finally, we are starting to have some real concrete anthropological evidence for our claims. Our claims are not that society started polytheistic. Our claim is that wherever and whenever there were human beings, they also went hand in hand in parallel with belief in God in a true manner. In fact, we say that God instilled that and made sure that the first human being was a prophet, so was in direct contact with the divine to make sure that the trajectory of humanity would start on the right path right from the beginning. And this needs more explanation in the next lesson. This is our starting point. So how did we get into polytheism? And when we read in the Quran all these societies that are polytheistic, what's the issue? We have in our, a lot of people refer to Kalam and to scholars of Kalam. I go directly to the Imams. We have in our Imams commentaries on specific verses of the Quran that say many of the societies that became polytheistic, what happened is that they had very wise men, very good men that they wanted to honor. And they wanted to keep their legacy and their memory alive. So with time, they built statues for them. And with time, they started to worship those statues and those symbols, and they made them into divinities. And they started giving sacrifices to them, and they created rituals around them. And so a lot of the deities or divinities were actually very good people, and some of them perhaps even divine people. Now, the distortion comes here. This is how with time, there is a distortion, and therefore maybe the need for another religion, a new religion that puts humanity back on track. This requires another lesson. We'll keep it at that for now. All religions share a common set of beliefs, if they are true, as the author says. Those beliefs are three: believe in God as creator and Lord and sovereign of the universe, believe in an afterlife, that there's something that happens, and believe in a message that was communicated to humanity that teaches them how to live between the origin, which is God, and the afterlife. If those points there's a consensus around them, then we say that their worldview is the theistic worldview. Otherwise, it's the non-theistic worldview. That's how he's defining it. What about other differences that we find in other religions? So we say one religion, even though they're theistic, there's differences. This is where, because we were talking about the notion of deen, and I'm just mentioning it in passing, this is where we have to make the difference between shar' and deen. Deen is the part of religion that does not change. Although we use it as the term religion, the Quran doesn't. The Quran says, إِنَّ الدِّينَ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ الْإِسْلَامِ. Islam is the only religion. But not Islam in the sense that we understand it today. Not our practical laws. Not the details of our faith. Islam is the faith and beliefs that were communicated to all the prophets, from Adam to our Prophet ﷺ. This is what is considered Islam. And then there are discrepancies and differences and variances in there that are meant. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of the different societies and their needs of the time, will change in those things, in those laws and those beliefs. It's going to be refined, it's going to be more sophisticated. One religion is good for 10,000 years ago, and another is supposed to be good till the end of times. They can't be at the same level of complexity. This is how we understand shar'. So when people say sharia, the Quran uses the term. It says, and to each of you, وَلِكُلٍّ مِنْكُمْ جَعَلْنَا شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. And to each of you, although you all share the common deen, the common religion, the difference is in the shar', is in the minhaj, which is the little path that we have given you to follow. Principles and secondary principles. So we're saying that there are three main principles. Tawheed, God; Ma'ad, afterlife; and prophethood in the middle, the message. So what do we do about the rest? There's divine justice, and there's Imam. This is where we get into some debates between our scholars and who considers what falling in what sphere. The presentation that has been given until now in this lesson is that he is linking it with other religions and talking about a generic worldview. And in that sense, certainly divine justice would not be required, and imamah would be very difficult to prove, except if you already have the premises of a Shia. Okay, so if we keep it at that simple level, the presentation he gave works. So why did divine justice become one of usul? There are reasons. It's because there was a point in time where people were actually being designated as adli, which is you a believer in justice and divine justice or not. And based on that, you are in religion or out of religion. This happened, there was one of the companions of the Holy Prophet, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, who became governor, and then a lot of people followed his ideas, and with time it became an entire school of thought called al-Ash'ari. They do not believe in divine justice, although they do not say it that way. The reality is that they say we cannot impose our conception of justice on God. And therefore you cannot tell God, so and so because he prayed and he fasted, you must grant him heaven, and so because he was bad, you must grant him hell. That doesn't work. God can do whatever he wants. And they use Quranic verses and so on and so forth for their belief. In opposition to that, you have another school, which are the Mu'tazila, who tried to take a much more rational approach to all of this. And they said, no, it is impossible. The whole system crumbles. God is just. And therefore, this is where we extract our notion of justice. And whatever we consider just, if the reason considers it just, then God must also accept it as justice. He gave us this reason. And of course, we have our imams. who taught us that it's actually neither one or, but our conception is closer to the Mu'tazila, so we were lumped together with the Mu'tazila, and divine justice, because of its socio-political importance at that time, was elevated from being discussed as an attribute of God. Is God just or not? Is God knowledgeable or not? Is God powerful or not? You'd study all of this in Tawheed. But they took out Al-Adl separately and made it at the level of Tawheed as though it's as important because of its preeminence, because of its presence and what it's causing in society. And so it became one of the usul, one of the principles of faith became Al-Adl. What about Imam? Same notion. There are, in certain circles, if you say that you believe in Imamah, you are included. And if you don't, you are excluded. And as Shia, we strongly believe in that. But this is where we have to think. And some scholars have already done that. And they've made a distinction between, do we need one set of beliefs, or do we say there are layers? So do we have usul ad-din and then usul madhab? So while you are in one sphere of inclusion, that's what I called it, there's a sphere of inclusion. To get into that sphere, there are three criteria: God, afterlife, message. And then there's a smaller sphere within that, called, for instance, Imamiyya, to use the same term, or Adliyya, to use the same term. For instance, Shia, for instance, Mu'tazila, for instance, Sha'ira. To be included in there, you have to believe in divine justice, or you have to believe in Imam. Whereas if you keep Imamah at the level of the five and you say, to enter into Islam, you need belief in Imamah, then you've just excluded out of Islam that entire group of people who do not believe in it as one of the fundamentals of religion. And this is why our scholars will disagree, and it will have, because it's a worldview, it has ramifications in the ideology, and therefore their practical laws and their fatwa will change. And some of them will say, and therefore he is tahir, and therefore he is najis. Okay? Keep that in mind, quickly. And then I'll finish with this question, which is, all of this is based on the construction of scholars. So maybe this is a call for us to go back into the Quran, and to go back into the lives of the Holy Prophet and Ahlul Bayt, and to see, is the spirit of Islam that they were trying to teach us more inclusive or more exclusive? Are we more elitist, and we put more criteria to say, and therefore you are one of us, and it's really difficult to get in? Or were they more inclusive of people and intentionally more open with their definitions so that we have more people included in it? What's the spirit of Islam? And I don't have an answer. I'm leaving it as an open question to think about, and I think that's all we had for today. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.